Once a year, a splendid, mysterious stronghold springs up on the southern shore of the Baltic Sea. Many centuries ago, Vineta was a wealthy, flourishing city unparalleled by any of its Baltic rivals. Merchants from distant lands sailed into its port, trading local goods in exchange for gold and silver. The people of Vineta grew rich quickly and flaunted their wealth. But the richer they became, the more arrogant, audacious, and vainer they got. Until the time when the gods punished their boldness. City of the Sunken Gods. For centuries, the legend of the rich, sunken city of Vineta has inspired historians and treasure hunters alike. It was said to lie on the south coast of the Baltic in the estuary of the Oder, which drains into the Bay of Szczecin, and through three straits, Dziwna, Świna, and Piana, into the sea. So where should we look for it? There was an island of Vineta on Eilhard Lubinus's map of Pomerania of 1618, but it turned out to be just a rocky ledge. So was Vineta merely a fantasy?
Mówimy cały czas niby.
All the time we're talking of something like a legend, a piece of fantastic fiction, but it has its connections with facts, roots in reality. The area of today's island and town of Wolin. Wolin is Poland's largest island facing the open sea. The town lies in its southeastern corner on the Dziwna Strait through which the Oder drains into the Baltic. The story of the area's inhabitants is reflected in the landscape of Wolin, which before 1945 belonged to Germany. After the Second World War, Wolin became part of Poland. New people settled in the ruins of the war-torn town. Life went on, but every so often strange artifacts were found here, exciting archaeologists and journalists alike. An open-air archaeological reconstruction had been set up on the opposite bank of the river, where history buffs meet to reenact the city's fascinating but still questionable past. Is Wolin the site of the legendary Vineta? Who controlled it? The Princess of Poland or the Vikings? Are the idols discovered here statues of Slavic gods? Few towns of the barbarian Europe of old can boast a history as rich as Wolin's. 11th and 12th century chroniclers paid a good deal of attention to Wolin, which also won a permanent place in the tradition of the Scandinavian sagas. In recent decades, the past of this town has aroused the active interest of archaeologists. Wolin had already caught archaeologists' attention in the late 19th century. The first expedition was led by the eminent German pathologist Rudolf Virchow, who was also an amateur archaeologist and collaborator of Heinrich Schliemann, the discoverer of ancient Troy. His observations in many parts of the town convinced him there had been a rich and splendid settlement here. Extensive records of German archaeological work done in the 1930s have survived in the National Museum in Szczecin. In accordance with the expectations of Nazi Germany, they describe a large settlement dubbed Wendisch Viking. Sensational reports appeared in the press that maybe Wolin was indeed the legendary Vineta. Polish archaeologists started systematic research in Wolin in 1952, when the town was still full of ruins after the war. The first to continue the pre-war search for Vineta was the young archaeologist Władysław Filipowiak, who for the next 60 years would lead projects in various parts of the town, which owe their names to the local topography and the traditions of Vineta. Gallows Bird Hill, South Settlement, Southern Suburb, Old Town, Garden Quarter, and Silver Hill. For years, new layers were excavated and thousands of artifacts were found, many of them unique. Archaeologists and scientists from other fields worked to get as much information from them as possible to reconstruct the history of the stronghold. But there are still many unsolved mysteries despite 60 years of work, as Professor Filipowiak admits. I wouldn't be surprised if there were still many sensational new discoveries ahead of us. What do we know about Wolin's history from the research? The town lies on a 3-kilometer stretch of sand and gravel along the Dziwna Strait. But 1,000 years ago, its natural landscape was definitely different. Vestiges might be the pond and waterlogged meadow south of the old town. What was the lay of the land at the time? The question was put to geologists specializing in paleogeography, the reconstruction of ancient landscapes. Geochemical tests on soil samples showed changes in the chemical composition of sediments near the river. Scientists used these results to get a picture of the landscape at that time. The area was once marshy, waterlogged, and could have been seasonally flooded after the spring thaw or by tidal waves during a storm. The only habitable areas in the southeast of the island next to the river were patches of elevated land separated from each other by marshes. Archaeologists found that the earliest settlement had been established on the highest hill at the turn of the 8th and 9th century. Gradually, the neighboring hilltops were settled too. There was not much wild game in the area, so the people bred domestic animals, mostly pigs, then cattle, sheep, and goats. They also fished, mainly in the river and its vernal pools rather than out at sea, as shown by the fish bones discovered. Very little of herring, but much more of sweetwater fish, like perch, bream, and zander. But most of all, of sturgeon, up to 3 meters in length. Fish and the meat of domestic animals made up the inhabitants' staple diet. In the late 9th century, the settlement started to develop at a rapid rate. New dwellings, workshops, and storage facilities went up. The settlement turned into a port, and its people engaged in boat building, as the discovery of the remains of a shipyard showed. Archaeologists have found fragments of boats in many places along the island's coast. Their hulls were made of hand-hewn, lap-jointed oak timber, with moss, animal fur, fleece, or fabric to fill in the joins and wooden pegs to hold them fast. Tests showed that the pegs were made of soft pine, chopped off logs with the use of hard oak tools. In the National Museum at Szczecin, you can see the remains of similar Slavic trading boats used in the region in the early Middle Ages. They could sail to distant places on the Baltic. The Slavs living on Vodin Island realized their location offered them a good opportunity for development. It was the point where trading routes crossed from Central Europe along the Oder for Scandinavia and from the west to Russia over the Baltic. The large amounts of glass beads found here, the weighing scales and weights, the Arabian silver coins, whole and cut, are just a few examples of the archaeological evidence showing the remote parts of Europe and Asia from which traders representing different cultures sailed into Vodin. The port was becoming more widely known as large merchant vessels could dock on its long, sturdy shoreline. The local people traded in agricultural produce, mainly cereals, as well as pottery, especially large ceramic vessels, salt, and the prized Baltic amber. Products from distant lands arrived in Vodin, not only from the territories of the Western Slavs and Western Europe, but also from Russia, Byzantium, and the Arabian Caliphates. Merchants from Scandinavia started to take a more and more prominent part in the trading. Their presence is marked by the occurrence of glass beads made in Scandinavian workshops and serving as an expensive testimonial to the fashion of those times. They were easy to ship in large quantities and could be sold at a good profit. Vodin was beginning to compete with the biggest ports on the Baltic. Curiously, the proof for Vodin's rapid growth lies in its natural environment. Every year, a new layer of plant pollen settles at the bottom of lakes and peat bogs, enabling scientists to identify the vegetation growing in a locality in the remote past. Research on Vodin has revealed a striking level of deforestation in this period, not just along the river, but all over the island. It was evidently a very sudden change as documented by the large amount of timber that had to be felled to construct Vodin and its port precinct. A vast transformation took place. The wharf and the fortifications put up around Silver Hill, the center of the settlement, and its southern suburb were the biggest building project in Vodin's history. The people of Vodin have 70 strongholds, wrote the Bavarian geographer in the mid-9th century. Vestiges of them can still be spotted today. In spite of that, many princes, including Mieszko I of Poland, were tempted to take control of this port. Mieszko's early state centered on the river Warta, which is a tributary of the Oder, and hence the main port for that principality would have been Vodin. That's why Mieszko tried to expand his realm out to the estuary of the Oder. Several other powers were competing for the control of this region. The German Empire, the West Slavic tribes, and the Scandinavian countries. The people of Wolin were themselves vexing Mieszko, perhaps in anticipation of his attack, with raids on his territory under the command of Wichman, a mercenary banished from Saxony, whose services they had hired. A chronicler reported that they were fighting against Mieszko with a considerable force. But in 967, the tide turned, and Prince Mieszko, assisted by his Czech allies, wreaked a terrible vengeance on Wichman and his Wolin masters. Victory, did Mieszko take control of Wolin and the Oder estuary? Historians differ in their opinions, as the chronicles don't mention the subject. What about archaeological evidence? The remains of massive fortifications dated to the times of Mieszko's victories have been discovered in Wolin's old town. Curiously, the beams in the wall were held together by means of hook-shaped joins. This kind of structure, discovered at various sites in Mazovia, Lesser Poland, and even Moravia, is regarded as proof of the presence of Piast princes there. What could the place have been like in Mieszko's times? The archaeological materials found here and their dating suggest it was a huge group of settlements growing all the time. On the basis of this evidence, scientists have made a virtual reconstruction of the town in its heyday. On arrival, you'd see various districts of Wolin appearing from beyond the lighthouse on Gallows Bird Hill. It is said to have belonged to the mightiest of the kings of the Slavs. It was big, the destination for many ships, the fairest port in these parts. Records based on the accounts of the Arabian chronicler Ibn Said reported. The people of the town on the Dzivna River not only had ships and specialist workshops, but also commercial experience and a knowledge of geography, which made Wolin, with an estimated population of 8 to 10,000, one of the main trading emporia on the Baltic, alongside Hautby, Pirkia, and Staraya Ladoga.
Emporia
were settlements that sprang up along the coast of the Baltic or the White Sea, often on river mouths, so they were typical coastal points of intersection for routes leading inland. This was true of Wolin as well. They flourished in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries and were characteristically multicultural. The merchants included Scandinavians, known for trading in weapons and other items made of iron and colored metals, produced from their rich deposits of metal ore. But there was another valued commercial commodity for which you can hardly expect to find archaeological evidence: slaves, brought to Wolin from the lands in the Oder and Warta basins, the territories of Mieszko. It was a lucrative business conducted by Scandinavians on a massive scale. They had contracts and good money from the Arabian Caliphate, to which they sent large numbers of Slavic slaves via Russia and down the Volga. So many that Arabian observers wrote of swarms of Slavic locusts on the streets of Baghdad. Payments were usually made in silver. Silver coins from nearly all the regions where they were minted at the time have been found in Volyn. There were whole specimens and cut coins used for small change. In the northern part of the agglomeration, there is a place called Silver Hill. The name comes from the 14th century when large quantities of silver, both coins and shavings, started to be found here. These hoards of silver had been deliberately buried. But was it just a 10th century way of safeguarding assets? There's another theory. It was connected with a Scandinavian religious idea. They believed that objects buried underground could be used by deceased members of the family, who could then help relatives still alive. Scientists have not yet determined exactly why people buried their silver, but they know enough to confirm that the Arabian silver that reached Volyn was shipped along the Oder to the heart of Mieszko's realm. For the first princes of the Piast dynasty, Volyn was literally a vein of gold. Not only wealthy merchants, but also excellent craftsmen visited Volyn. Many of the products discovered here are decorated with symbols that might have been new or unfamiliar to local residents. In the archaeological finds from Volyn, there is a lot of Scandinavian art, rare not only for the south coast of the Baltic, but also for Scandinavia itself. Its quality and quantity tell us that it must have been made for Scandinavian customers living in Volyn. The large amounts of scrap material left from the processing of horn and antler and the remains of workshops, pits, and hearths archaeologists have discovered on Silver Hill show there must have been horn craftsmen working there. Similar sites have been discovered in the Old Town and the southern suburb. Horn was used to make handles for knives, belt buckles, and combs. There are also signs of many jewelers' workshops making items in colored metals. Lead, tin, and silver products and shavings have been found, but most of the discoveries are of copper and bronze artifacts, many with features typical for Scandinavian art. Are there any other signs of a Scandinavian presence? The chronicler Adam of Bremen doesn't mention Scandinavians at all in his account of Yumne, that is Volyn. It is inhabited by Slavs and other nations, Greeks and barbarians. Newcomers from Saxony are allowed to settle as well, provided they do not demonstrate their Christian emblems, for all the people there are still beholden to the pagan errors. Adam's record tells us Slav paganism was still the dominant religion. Archaeological confirmation appeared to come with the discovery in 1973 in the Old Town of the remains of a special building surrounded by a court and dated to 967. A small, four-faced statue regarded as the Slavic god Światowit was found there, followed by another sensational discovery in the environs of a few more small statues, each with one face. were said to be idols of the Slavic gods. The archaeologists put forward a hypothesis that the structure was a Slavic pagan temple. Additional evidence came when they discovered the remains of a stable nearby, perhaps for a horse consecrated to the deity. Before a military expedition, the horse would be made to pass over a line of spears. If he touched any of them, it was taken as a bad omen. Wolin started to be regarded as a powerful center for the Slavic pagan religion, but recently hypotheses have been put forward that the Wolin statuettes are not of the Slavic, but the Scandinavian gods. The written sources speak of Scandinavians as having their own places of worship, in which idols with human faces were the principal objects before which sacrifices would be offered up. Supporters of this theory say that the idol has a base like a wedge-shaped whetstone, which had a religious meaning for the Scandinavians. We won't know for certain whether the idols should be considered Slavic or Scandinavian until we get more research results. And we'll need more research to know what the structure believed to be a pagan temple really was. Some glass beads, items decorated in a manner typical for the Viking art, and weights discovered inside this structure suggest it might have been the house of a Scandinavian merchant. What do we know about the religion of the people of Wolin at the time? It's only certain that Mieszko didn't manage to convert them to Christianity. The written sources mention pagan rites and places of worship, but only for later times. No information on religion has come from the examination of the burial grounds, either cremation or inhumation. Graves were sparsely furnished, but testimonials of Scandinavian religious practices have been found at Wolin. Amber pendants and hammer or shoe-shaped amulets, familiar from Norse mythology. Also a board with a runic inscription reading "Cut out the runes" has been found. All evidence of a Scandinavian elite in the town. Could Mieszko's influence have been declining? A formidable rival appeared on the scene, Harald Bluetooth, King of Denmark, who took control of the Oder estuary. The fame of Wolin spread as far north as Iceland, which had been settled by Vikings. In the 12th century, local saga tellers were praising the exploits of Viking heroes from the mighty stronghold Yomsburg, which, like Vineta, was said to lie on the estuary of the Oder. After a long quest for its whereabouts, Yomsburg started to be identified with Vineta. Wolin's chief link with Scandinavia and the legends is of course the group of Joms Vikings, reputed to have settled here and built the mighty fortress with its 300 ships. From here, they are said to have sailed on their expeditions. According to the sagas, Palnatoki was the jarl of the Viking troops settled in Yomsburg by King Harald Bluetooth. The Vikings were the best Scandinavian warriors engaged in trading and the settlement of new lands. But they are associated above all with piracy and looting. They were famous for their valor and courage and believed that death in battle brought eternal glory. Their very appearance was terrifying, though they never wore the horned helmets in which they are often depicted. In the old Scandinavian sagas, the Vikings of Yomsburg were the most renowned. Vikings set out on their pirate raids to very distant parts of the world. They were excellent sailors. Their quick boats reached opulent maritime and inland ports. They invaded England, Ireland, and France. They reached North America a long time before Columbus. They also traveled east to Kievan Rus, Byzantium, and the Caliphate of Baghdad. How did they make it to their destinations? What helped them with navigation? A wooden disc considered to be a solar compass has been found in the Garden District. Viking longships were about 40 meters long and made of thin, flexible planks held together with lap joints and mounted on a frame. They had a single mast with a characteristic rectangular sail. Longships could do up to 60 knots, nearly 30 kilometers an hour. But no traces of any longships have been found at Wolin. The Vikings were mercenaries. Kings and princes hired their services. Mieszko could well have had a Viking troop. He was a skillful diplomat, good at achieving his political aims by peaceful means as well. One of his brilliant moves was to offer the hand of his daughter Świętosława in marriage to Eric the Victorious, King of Sweden. Known as Sigrid Storada in the Scandinavian sagas, she later married King Svein of Norway, Denmark, and briefly England, and was always a spokesperson for Piast interests on the Baltic. Her Danish sons, Mieszko's grandchildren, all became kings and played an important role politically. Relations between the first Piast rulers and Scandinavia were of paramount significance for both parties. The sagas tell us that you weren't born a Viking. Slavs could become Vikings. It was a profession calling for dedication and fortitude. A Viking had to be an agile, well-trained warrior and fight to the last drop of blood for his troop. When they weren't fighting, Jom's Vikings spent their leisure in the stronghold playing Knefatafl. Archaeologists have found pieces for this board game at Wolin. Rigorous rules governed life in the camp, which was out of bounds for women. Vikings could not be away for longer than 3 days. They had to be ready for battle at any time. The discipline was strict. From the chronicles, we know that in 986, the legendary founder of Yomsburg, King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who had been wounded in battle, took refuge in Wolin. Distraught at having been deposed by his own son, he soon died of his wounds. Who controlled Wolin in Jom's Viking times? Maybe first Mieszko, then the Danes, then Sweden. Perhaps it returned to Mieszko's son Bolesław in the 11th century. In a Jom's Viking troop, the rules of cooperation, dedication, and fraternal assistance had to be supported by first-rate martial skills and training. Viking warriors were famous for their highly efficient wall of shields battle order. Most of the researchers agree that for a time, control of Yomsburg and hence of Wolin must have been in the hands of Bolesław the Brave, who is given such a wonderful image in the sagas. What do the sagas say Bolesław did? Nothing at all. He didn't have to. He was a king in the class of Charlemagne and Arthur. But it says a lot, of course in the context of legend, for the status of Poland under Bolesław the Brave. How does the legend of mighty Jomsburg relate to the reality of Wolin? Have any vestiges of a Viking stronghold been found here? so far there's no confirmation in the archaeology. Nothing from the graves examined over a century ago in the burial mounds on Gallows Bird Hill. Current research might indicate the Garden suburb, but there's no clinching evidence. Just as there wasn't for Silver Hill, shortlisted by German archaeologists before World War II. Maybe we should be looking for Yomsburg beyond the Wolin agglomeration. The local water level was much higher in Viking times than it is now. On the basis of the results of studies of climate changes, archaeological research, and an analysis of historical maps, scientists have compiled a simulation of the tide line changes around Wolin Island in the 10th century, showing that the river Dziwna could have taken a course west of today's town, giving rise to numerous navigable pools, which means the hunt for Yomsburg is still on. Will we manage to find it, or is it just a legend? If so, then what was the role of the Scandinavians at Wolin in the town's heyday? The Scandinavian factor, when it appears, plays a very important role for several generations, but it's never predominant. It's the Slavs who still control Wolin. The people of Wolin were a Valetian tribe of Western Slavs. They owed their self-determination to the commercial status of their Baltic port, which no outsiders had an interest to interfere with. Wolin is believed to have had a democratic system of government. How might it have worked? As an oligarchy of merchants and warriors with powerful clans and leaders negotiating governance on the basis of mutual consensus.
Przywódcami, którzy się lepiej lub gorzej dogadują.
The rapid growth of competitor ports, Szczecin, Kamień, and Kołobrzeg, posed a threat to the status of Wolin. The bed of the Dziwna Strait silted up, making navigation difficult and bringing about a crisis in maritime trading. The people of Wolin had to find new sources of income. They copied the example of the Vikings who had moved out of the area by then. Wolin turned to brigandage. Pirates from Wolin crossed the Baltic to raid, rob, terrorize, and lay waste Scandinavian settlements. They must have annoyed the Danes just a bit too much. In 1043, King Magnus the Good launched a big punitive expedition against Wolin. According to Scandinavian sources, the city was completely destroyed, though there is no archaeological evidence for this, and Wolin continued to be a significant port up to the late 12th century. But its heyday was definitely over. So, how can we explain the legend of Vineta? In 2012, during the construction of a yachting marina in a hitherto unexamined spot, the remains of a harbor were discovered. The excavated artifacts show that trade and craftsmanship flourished here. Tests on the timber dated the youngest trees to the early 940s, making them over 1,000 years old. So why do they look as if they'd just been felled quite recently? Their excellent condition is probably due to the fact that they must have been flooded pretty soon. So this part of the town of Wolin was sunk in the mid-10th century. The archaeologists found an intriguing object, the mouthpiece of an as yet unidentified wind instrument. It is made of horn and has 12 mysterious faces engraved on it. Images of the gods? At any rate, certainly witnesses of the disaster that befell the affluent port. The old chronicles have records of gigantic tidal waves sweeping in from the sea in this area during north winds from the Baltic. They could make the river rise even by 2 meters, flooding all the lower parts of Wolin. Was it perhaps such an occurrence that the legend of Vineta speaks of? The answer to that question is still the secret of the sunken gods. Scriptwriter and director Zdzisław Cozac. Scientific consultant Professor Przemysław Urbańczyk. English translation Teresa Bałuk-Ulewiczowa. English voiceover Sławomir Szewc. Production Zdzisław Cozac. Media Promocja Telewizja Polska 2014.